So hello, everyone. My name is Clay Gordon. I'm the creator of thechocolatelife.com, and I'm also the technical editor here at International Confectionery Magazine. Happy to have you join me here at Confectionery Live. So today I'm going to be talking to you about something that is important to all of us who are in the world of cocoa and chocolate, and that is heavy metals contamination. And I wanted to talk about this from a very, very specific perspective, in that recently there has been some reporting here in the United States around heavy metals contamination. And that reporting came from a very highly respected source, which is Consumer Reports magazine. They're very widely known for their reviews on automobiles and home appliances and things like that. But they recently posted about heavy metals contamination in chocolate, specifically lead and cadmium. And in their reporting on this topic, they mentioned another source, a California nonprofit organization called As You Sow, as some of the inspiration for what they were reporting on. And so what I want to do today is I want to talk to you about what the reporting was, right, and what it means for you and your business. So we're going to go over a number of key points, which are, again, what this recent reporting is, what are the real risks that are associated with. Are the real risks as bad as the reports indicate that they might be? Are the data reliable? Is the data reliable? Are the data reliable? And most importantly, how can these risks be communicated responsibly? So with that introduction, let's jump into it. Are you at risk? So we need to go and take a look at the idea that heavy metals contamination is bad, right? So especially with heavy metals that accumulate in the body. And so lead, once it comes into the body, is not likely to leave the body on its own. And over the course of months and weeks, years and decades, consumption of lead particularly can lead to, among other things, cognitive decline. So it can also interfere with reproductive abilities. And the same thing is true of cadmium. So cadmium is a heavy metal. It is found in many foods, as lead is, right? But we're focused on chocolate at the moment, right? So the idea is that if you are exposed to these heavy metals over a long period of time, then there can be very, very specific impacts on your personal health. Now, when it comes to chocolate, right, it's important to know that chocolate and cocoa products represent one of the lower forms of dietary exposure to heavy metals in the environment. That depending upon which regulatory body and which reporting organization has done the research, that it's barely cracks the top 10 of risks that you should worry about. Right? That grain and vegetables are much more acute in the sense that acute risks in the sense that you are more likely to be exposed to heavy metals contamination from overeating vegetables and wheat bread, for example, than you are with consuming chocolate. Now, having said that, right, there is an aspect in which bio-individuality comes into play. Your metabolism is different from my metabolism. I live in a different place from where you grow up. I eat, different foods in different quantities. And so each one of us needs to address the risks that each of us has. And one of the questions we have, right, about assessing, am I at risk, is understanding the data that is presented. So the data that were presented and the question of, are the data reliable? Now, I want to let you know that, this slide here is going to be a little difficult to read. And so if you will connect with me via my account here on Confectionery Live, you can go search for me, you can go and send me a message. What I will do is I will send you a copy of this presentation and specifically the slide so you can have it on your own. And you can take a look at it closely and then review this presentation while you're looking at it on your computer. So what I think is really, really important here is in the left-hand image. So this is data which was presented by this California NGO called As You Sow. And so people outside of the United States may not know that California is the most restrictive regulatory regime in the United States when it comes to things like environmental contamination, and not just in heavy metals. We have something that people know of called Prop 65, and we have on many of our, much of our packaging in California, what are called Proposition 65 warnings. If you've ever been to California and gone to a hotel room, you may have noticed, this room contains articles which contain substances known to the state of California to cause cancer or birth defects or something like that. So these are all coming out of Proposition 65 warnings. And so As You Sow several years ago did some research into heavy metals contamination in cocoa and chocolate, and they have presented their results on their website. And the link to the website is on the final slide of this presentation. So you can go and see for yourself that I'm not misrepresenting any of the data that has been presented. But one of the challenges that I have when I look at the data, and I spend a lot of time looking at reports and trying to understand, what data is being presented and what is, if not being misrepresented, what data are presented in a way that leads to questions about them. And so in this particular slide, we're looking at some of the products which have been tested, which come from the Hershey company in the United States. And in specific, many of the items that are listed on the slide are around Hershey's special dark chocolate. Now, this is a type of sweet chocolate, and it is the highest cocoa content dark chocolate that Hershey makes. But one of the things that really calls into question the results that are here is that we have two different tests. These are the second and third from the top when you go visit this, which appear to have been done at the same time. They're both presented as being from March of 2022. Right? And so in that March of 2022 timeframe, two tests for Hershey Special Dark Chocolate, but one of them has a lead measurement of 1.9, and this is micrograms per serving. And the other one has 2.4 micrograms of lead per serving. And the question that I ask is, are these two different tests? Were they done from two different laboratories? Are they two different tests and they were done by the same laboratory, but because the tests are not, well, there is a range of error which can happen in these tests, right? What's going on here? Could in fact, and I believe this is in fact the case, it seems to me the most likely case is that these are in fact two different batches of chocolate, right? And these two different batches of chocolate tested differently. So what this suggests to me is that there might be other batches of this chocolate which might have tested in which the results were very different. Now, why do I think that? There is a company, it's listed over here. On the right-hand side, it says high in both lead and cadmium. And one of the products that's there is a product from Lily's chocolate. And Lily's is owned actually by the Hershey company. And if you go and take a look at all the results for Lily's, what you'll find is that there's a set of results for Lily's before they were purchased from Hershey. And there was a set of results from Lily's after they were purchased from Hershey, and after they were purchased by Hershey. If we look closely, one of the things that we might learn is that before the Hershey acquisition, Lily's chocolate passed all of the tests from As You Sow. But after the Hershey's acquisition, what we find is that this is when we find that Lily's runs into problems with their tests. And one of the things that this suggests to me is that there's a change in sourcing practices in Lily's chocolate after the acquisition. Now, it's important to recognize that Hershey does not actually make chocolate. They do not process cocoa beans. And there's a link to an article where a senior executive at Hershey actually corroborates this fact. And it's referenced in the final page of this presentation. So if Hershey is not manufacturing its own chocolate, who does? And we know from that article that there are at least two companies that process the chocolate for them. And so the question becomes, okay, um, Lily's now appears to be using a different chocolate source from the one they were using before the acquisition. They're now using the same one that the Hershey company does. That makes an enormous amount of sense, right? But where does the liability for the heavy metals contamination come from, right? Does it actually come from Hershey? They're not processing cocoa beans, or does it come from the companies that manufacture the chocolate for them? And this sounds like an interesting question, and it's one that is going to be tested in courts of law here in the United States over the course of the next several months and years, because one of the results of the reporting from Consumer Reports is that there now have been at least 4 lawsuits filed in the state of New York against companies that are mentioned in the report. And what I want to do is also point out here a really, really important aspect of this reporting, which is confusing to many people, which is if you look at the results that are posted on Consumer Reports, they're posted in terms of micrograms per serving, with the idea being is that there's a maximum amount of lead and cadmium that you should consume in any given day. And in California, this is called the MADL, the minimum allowable daily, or the maximum allowable daily level, right? So, you can see here that one serving of these chocolates contributes more lead than the state of California says you should expose yourself to an entire day, irrespective of anything else you consume. So this is the challenge. But if you look over to the right, and what you'll do is you'll see on the Consumer Reports, right, article, what they do is they report in terms of percentages above and below this MADL level. And so they're presenting a number, and we don't actually know what that number is in reference to. And then complicating this even further, the state of California says that we really want to report in parts per million or parts per billion. And so the challenge becomes, okay, how do I as a consumer, or how do I as a chocolate maker or a confectioner understand what micrograms per serving is, as opposed to percentages above a level, as opposed to parts per million and parts per billion? So this is why the question about whether the data are reliable or not, and then how the data are presented, becomes really, really important to confusing people about what's going on. I mean, there's a bright red indicator here that says beep, 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 this is bad for you, as opposed to green indicators, which says these are not bad for you, right? But the way the data are presented is incredibly confusing, and is a part of the conversation we need to have with our customers. So again, what was overlooked or minimized in the reporting? Number one, other sources of risk. So chocolate is a source of risk, and it's not the biggest source of risk in most people's diets. People are more likely to be overdosed, for want of a better term, to have greater exposure of heavy metals in their diet from other things that they consume. The wheat in wheat bread, vegetables, and things like that. When it comes to lead contamination, it's important to know that lead has been phased out as an additive in motor vehicle fuels. It's been banned for many, many years. There were some stockpiles of this additive, which improved the octane of fuels until recently, and now it's completely gone. There's no more leaded gasoline anywhere in the world, which is being sold for motor vehicles. The place where it's being sold still is in aviation gas for piston engine airplanes. And so if you live near an airport, or you live near some place where there is crop dusting done, for example, so you have an airplane which is putting pesticides or fungicides or fertilizer onto crops, you're at much higher risk for lead contamination, because it's floating in the air and it's on everything that is nearby, than you are from consuming a small amount of chocolate. It's also important to understand that there are confounding factors. So for example, if you are a smoker, you are much more at risk for uptake, for secreting these heavy metals in your body, than if you are not a smoker. Right? So we need to be able to tease out, right, your specific risk for this. or the risk of your customers. And the point here is that what we want to be able to do, what we need to be able to do, is to be able to talk reliably about what it is that the reports are talking about. We want to communicate in a way that does not scare people, right? That says, chocolate, you're not going to get sick if you eat an ounce of chocolate, which is what some places have taken this data to suggest this is what's going to happen. You've eaten an ounce of chocolate, the brand is high in lead, you need to go through expensive chelation therapy in order to get rid of the lead in your body. We don't need to worry about that, right? We can talk about, okay, what are the other things that you're eating which might contribute to the contamination? How much chocolate are you consuming relative to the rest of your diet, right? So, and do you have any other confounding factors? I mean, do you have an illness, right? Are you smoking? Do you live with smokers, right? Are you in an environment where there is smoking? All of these things are going to contribute to your heavy metals uptake. And you're not going to be able to distinguish them from consuming, from what you consume during the chocolate. And then finally, the compounds in chocolate, specifically antioxidants, for example, that will reduce the uptake of cadmium in the body. If you are iron deficient, so if you have anemia as a confounding factor, if you are eating foods which might have some heavy metals contamination, but are also very high in iron, spinach, for example, that the iron will reduce the uptake of cadmium in terms of what's going on. So we need to be able to look at chocolate as one part of a much larger mosaic, a puzzle, and understand that it is a piece of a much larger problem. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, why are these people focusing on chocolate, right? It represents a relatively small risk, but why are they focusing on chocolate? My personal belief is that we have an emotional connection with the chocolate that we consume that's different from the connection we have with broccoli or cornbread or something like that. And so we think about chocolate in a very different way. And these companies are preying upon that connection and emotion. So there are some really interesting things that we can learn from the data that are presented. I mean, we need to infer them, right? We need to look closely at them and understand what's going on behind them, because they are not directly reported. And I personally think that this may be deliberate, that there's a lot of data that can be presented, and it's difficult to understand the relationships, especially if you're trying to communicate this information to the non-professional public. But let's take an example of several of the places where we can get some information out of the data. The first one of which is that African cocoa is not always lower in cadmium than cocoa from South America. Now, all we have to do is we look at the products which have been tested and have been reported on. We go look at the products, we look at who the manufacturer is, and we can infer, right, based on experience that we have with these brands, where the chocolate comes from, if they make it themselves or if they're buying it from another company who's making it for them. And then from that we can infer, okay, this is where the cocoa beans are coming from. And what we see is there's not a simple relationship between West African cocoa good and South American cocoa bad, right? Which is surprising to me. I looked at this and I said, that's not the outcome I would have expected. So it's very, very interesting as a data point to say, why is this the case? Just need to understand why this is the case, right? What we'll also do is we find out that lead is more likely to be a problem in African cocoa than it is in South American cocoa. Again, look at the brands, look at the products, look at the companies who are manufacturing the chocolate, and from that infer where the cocoa beans are coming from. We already know that more than 80% of cocoa beans come from 4 countries in West Africa. So that gives a really, really good clue. And many chocolates which are now made from cocoa beans from a specific origin list that origin on the label somewhere. So we can go and make some pretty strong inferences from the data that are presented, right, into getting to some questions about that data as well. And so part of that process, right, as I've alluded to, means that we need to understand corporate ownership. So for example, Lindt, which is a Swiss-based company, owns Ghirardelli, which is a storied American brand. And so when you talk about Lindt and Ghirardelli, you can't talk about them separately. They're different brands. They're essentially the same company, and their sourcing relationships will be intermingled. And so we need to look at them not just independently, but look at them together. We also want to understand, as I spoke earlier, that about the acquisition history. So Lily's as a company, when it was independent, all of their products tested in the green, but after the Hershey acquisition, some of their products started testing as being too high in lead specifically. And so why is that? Why is that the case? My inference is that when Hershey purchased Lily's, Lily's was able to take advantage of the manufacturing relationships that Hershey had in order to be able to reduce the cost of ingredients. They would be able to get their chocolate less expensively, right? But that means they're using the same sources that Hershey is using, and now they have the same problem that Hershey has with heavy metals contamination, right? And out of this, we have to ask ourselves, why is lead more likely to be a problem in African cocoa than it is in South American cocoa? So if the source of contamination is small piston airplanes, then it would seem to me that a small country like Ecuador, where the cocoa fields are much more likely to be next door to someplace that is being sprayed, crop dusted, right? That's where the contamination come from. But if I'm in Cote d'Ivoire and I'm hundreds of miles from someplace, where is the source of lead contamination come from? If the source of contamination is aviation gas. So it's teasing these relationships out is an interesting question, because eventually what we want to do is we want to prevent the contamination of the beans. So we want to prevent the contamination, and it turns out that the way we would prevent the contamination may be different, right, in one country or one region than it would be from another country to another region. And this is why it's important to go and take a look at these data and look behind what the surface presentation is. Finally, one of the things that's really interesting about this is that, for example, Trader Joe's is a grocery company, and they manufacture very little of what it is that they sell. Almost everything that they sell is some sort of white label manufacturing or private label manufacturing relationship. So Trader Joe's is not manufacturing chocolate. They're buying chocolate. They're buying chocolate from the same company that almost every other every other company whose products were tested, right, gets it from. And so, it's like, okay, understanding that Trader Joe's is not the source of the chocolate, but a big chocolate manufacturer, cocoa processor, is the source of that chocolate, helps us tease out where the web of relationships is. And we need to do that. We need to understand these things in order to be able to communicate responsibly. Keep in mind that what we want to do, the purpose of this, is to be able to communicate confidently, right, to our customers, that we know what we're talking about and that we're taking their concerns seriously. So what's one of the first things you can do? Number one is just reassure people they're not going to get sick from eating one serving, even if that serving is out of line, even if it tests high. They're not going to get sick from one serving. Right? Number two, right? Why is that the case? Is because that for every single one of us, right, our body, right, has a different chemistry from the person next to us, and we live in different places, right, and the environment is different, and all of those things, right, will play a role in how much chocolate plays a risk in terms of overall exposure to heavy metals, right? So, we need to create a larger puzzle and say, here's the piece that chocolate fits into, right? Third, tell them that, the published results, right, do not provide clear and convincing evidence that any one particular product. So, for example, in the Hershey Special Dark example, we have two different tests from the same day that have two different results. And we don't know why. It could be that they're different batch codes. But what you don't know is if the batch code that you ate for that product, right, has a higher or lower level. So you can't know from this one test, this one done, almost a year ago, whether the product that you're eating is in fact suffers the same issue, right, that the tests might indicate. Number four, the risk from eating chocolate with heavy metals does exist. Do not minimize the risk. But it's only one of many other sources of risk, and we need to hold that in. We need to understand that context. So yeah, if you're worried about it, there are two things you can do. Number one, consume responsibly, right? So you can change your eating habits. That will work, right? You might change to a different chocolate. You might consume less. But if you are really worried about it, go to your doctor, ask for a test, right? Get tested for heavy metals, and you will understand for yourself the risk for you, right? And it's important that your doctor tells you about the right kind of test, which is why going to a doctor or somebody who knows about this should be communicated. But what you want to be able to do is communicate to your customers confidently that you understand what's going on. So what can you do as a chocolate maker or a confectioner to help minimize liability, right? And your risk, business risk, right? So number one, right? When you buy a chocolate, require a technical data sheet, right? Or if you're buying cocoa beans, require a certificate of analysis for which there is a specific test for heavy metals, right? Cadmium, lead, specifically, maybe arsenic. There could be some other ones that you want to test for, right? But make sure that that is a test, right? You need to understand the regulations for the market you're selling into. If your product gets sold to California, right, then you need to make sure that you meet California regulations. If your product is only sold in the EU regulations are much less strict. So understand where your market is and then adjust your recipes. And this is important. Do the math on your own recipes, right? So understand that if you use this percentage of cocoa with this level of cadmium or lead, then when you add all the other ingredients into it, this is the amount per serving, right? So do the math on your recipe is really important, right? And then for everything that you do, convert everything into a standard measure. So parts per million or parts per billion or micrograms per serving, whatever it is that you do, make sure that you are always working in the same unit of measurement, right? So because these things are much more complicated than converting feet into kilometers, right? If everything is in metric, for example, all the calculations are much simpler. Pick one measurement and use it. And then more importantly, put all this information into either your standard operating procedures, documents, or your HACCP control plan if you have one. Recording the data, right, means that you can speak confidently that said, we've taken the risk seriously. We have gone through the documentation, right? We've taken care of everything that we need, and that we can tell you confidently that, even if we don't individually test, right, every single product that comes out here, we are confident that the risk is negligible and it's below all of the regulations where in the markets that we sell. And then finally, right, here are some of the references that I spoke about during the course of the presentation. If you'd like this presentation, because you can't see the URLs here, please DM me, right? So go to my account here on Confectionery Live, DM me, and I will send you a copy of the presentation, right? And if you have any other questions about this, please get in touch, right? So I want to thank you all for joining me here today for this talk about reporting responsibly and talking responsibly about heavy metals contamination in cocoa and chocolate as a part of what I hope is just a fabulous experience at Confectionery Live this year. Cheers, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you soon.